I think that, when you open up the hood, there's a little bit more to be concerned with here, right? So a lot of the weakness was because of retail and wholesale margins being weak, which are, look, valuable data in PPI, but, it's an incomplete measure of margins. It's not, sort of the gospel truth about what's happening with profits right now. When you look at things like intermediate goods, so the input costs into business, which is not what headline PPI tells us about, but there is a sub-index that tells us about this. Those prices have been accelerating. So intermediate input costs for goods that are about to be sold to the final consumer grew 3.1% over the last 12 months, which, if you ignore the pandemic, is the highest since 2018. So there's some signs of acceleration there. There is also some signs of acceleration in final goods prices for consumer goods as well, which may be in part driven by tariff costs.
Well, Ernie, that's exactly where I was going to go next. Last month's figures on the PPI story was really felt like the first sign, or at least from a Wall Street perspective, that the tariff policy was finally showing up in the data after a couple of months of it not doing so. How does this now feed into the PCE data that the Fed more closely watches?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So look, PPI is a complicated jumble. It's a great data source. But one thing that everybody needs to keep in mind is that PPI does not include direct imports. So, direct to consumer imports, like made in Japan, made in China goods are not counted in PPI. They do affect seller prices in the sense that, like, if input costs go up, like, that can affect PPI down the line. But it's only a partial sense of, how tariffs are affecting things. I think CPI and PCE overall are much better measures, at least to look at the consumer impact of tariffs. And there we see very clear signs, especially among durable goods, appliances, electronics, furniture, that durable goods have been, that their prices have been rising faster than they did last year. They're up more than 2% against pre-2025 trend, whereas durable goods prices fell over the same period in 2024 by this point. So there's clearly some consumer pass-through happening as a result of tariffs. It's mainly affecting durable goods prices, obviously not services.
Ernie, we were talking to Liz Pancotti about this just the other day. The fact she said that all the front loading that we saw before tariffs took effect are still the goods largely that we're buying, that starting shortly, all tariffed goods will begin hitting shelves, and it could have a real impact on the holiday shopping season. Do you have that same expectation for, say, the next 3 months?
Yeah, there are all sorts of factors that are sort of delaying and shifting when we see tariffs fully biting. One of which is the inventory issue, especially with apparel. Apparel ought to be one of the most sensitive categories of goods to tariffs, but we haven't seen, outsized price increases in apparel so far. I think that's because retailers and manufacturers stocked up on apparel beforehand, but eventually that's going to run out as we burn through inventories. We could see some effects as soon as tomorrow's CPI report with August, because when you think about the goods that are the most affected by tariffs, you think electronics, household supplies, and apparel, which are back to school items, right? And, which is what, the period that we just went through in August. But if we don't see much of an effect, I have the same worry that as we get closer to the holiday shopping season in November and December, there won't be any more sort of cushion for companies to absorb these tariffs anymore.
Ernie, you mentioned it there, the CPI report tomorrow. Let's push forward to that. In the last report, we saw shelter prices really feeding in a big, big way. Talk to us about the housing story in America right now, because on the one hand, you hear just monumental increases in New York, LA, Miami even, but then you look at your second tier cities and they're starting to come down. What do you make of that widening gap?
Yeah, first thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to CPI or PCE, there's just a lag between, the rents that you see in these cities or the housing prices that you see in these cities and their effect on the published CPI and PCE data. There's a lag of about 12 months. So that's, number one. Number two, we have a housing shortage in America, and it's particularly severe in large coastal cities right now. At the same time, there's less churn in the housing market than there has been in the past, in part because of high interest rates. They're still weighing on housing churn. Look, I think that next year, in terms of CPI and PCE, we could start seeing more upward pressure on that component, of CPI and PCE, which is, potentially going to be concerning for the Fed. Right now, the housing component of CPI and PCE, at least as of last month, we'll see what happens tomorrow, has been relatively tame. And in fact, in the July CPI, the housing component of CPI was basically back at pre-pandemic levels, whereas housing had been a much more top-tier driver of, the inflation overshoot that we had seen in 2022 and 2023.
Yeah, interesting, Ernie. We're talking right now about the potential for a government shutdown at the end of this month, and that wouldn't typically have a real impact on the economy. But I wonder if we had a record shutdown, and they're talking about the possibility of something going months, not weeks, into potentially the new year, because there would be no off-ramp, for instance, and the president, the administration would have a lot of leeway over the amount of money that was spent, the number of workers who would be allowed to come in each day. Would a protracted shutdown measured by months have an economic impact, or would it dampen consumer spending?
I think it would have a non-zero impact on the economy. I distinguish between two different things: a government shutdown and a debt ceiling crisis, right? In terms of political shocks. Debt ceiling crisis is just on a whole other tier in terms of its impact on markets, impact on the economy. We've looked at government shutdowns in the past, both us and, lots of different economists. And it's really hard to see a discernible impact. And what impact there is quickly reverses itself once the shutdown ends. And that's particularly true of recent shutdowns, because it used to be that government workers weren't necessarily guaranteed back pay. And that law has changed, where now they are guaranteed back pay. And so now it's just a matter of you're waiting it out, and then, they're made whole when the shutdown ends. That doesn't mean that there's no impact. If I had to put it in GDP terms, I might put it at, the equivalent of 0.3 percentage points off of growth for every month that a shutdown goes on, right? Which is, again, non-zero, but then that quickly corrects itself when the shutdown ends. So, if I'm in very short run markets, it should affect my strategy. But if I'm in any sort of medium term market, it's irrelevant.